All right, welcome everybody. On behalf of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, thank you for coming out to our Ideas and Issues and Ideas Forum on private education and the survey we completed. We appreciate this. A great turnout today. I want to give a welcome to each of you who are able to attend here in person, as well as those of us who are watching online because of the live streaming. That will kind of dictate some of the format of the event. At your table, you will notice some blank cards with the Mackinac logo on them that are available for a Q&A time. If you have any questions that pop into your mind during the presentation, please jot them down. We'll have Jacob back there and Alexa over here. They'll help collect those, and we'll read those off after the presentation. Looks like everybody's got themselves set for food, but if not, the lunch buffet is over in the next room. Please help yourselves. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to give a special acknowledgement and thanks to a couple of groups in particular. The Michigan Association of Nonpublic Schools, Brian Broderick, Deb Cam, the Michigan Catholic Conference, Paul Stankiewicz and his team, for all their help in crafting this survey, for promoting the survey, for providing critical feedback on the report that you see in front of you. Without their help, we wouldn't have the great product that we do. So thanks to both those groups. And you will notice on the table there are copies of the report. Please feel free to help yourself to a complimentary copy, and they'll probably also help you as you follow along during the presentation. Now it's my privilege to introduce our special guest speaker for today. Rachel White is a doctoral candidate at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on K-12 education governance and finance. Rachel previously served as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Ohio College Access Network while obtaining a Master's in Education Policy and Leadership from Ohio State University. And Rachel received her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. And I promised her today that there'll be no questions about, after all that, where her football loyalties lie. I'll let you figure that out on your own. With that, let's welcome Rachel.
Thanks, Ben. I'm gonna mic up here. All right, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, first, thank you. Big thanks to the Mackinac Center for bringing me in today and allowing me to assist on this report. It was a great opportunity to really be able to dive into a new and unique data set that does not exist, and I think provides a lot of important information that people need to understand when looking at the overall education sector in the state of Michigan. So today I'm just going to run through some of the findings of the reports, and then I would like to focus a lot too just on Q&A that y'all might have about the research. So just a little bit of background. I'm sure all of you are aware. Hang on. Of Michigan's background in private education. I know a lot of you are in that field, but as of the latest figures, there's 601 private schools in the state, located in 70 of Michigan's 84 counties. Approximately 130,000 students are served by private schools, which is approximately 7% of Michigan's K-12 student population. So sort of the impetus for this report, there's a lot of publicly available school data on public schools. As you can see here, I just tried to summarize some of that data, but we have things from student mobility to outcomes, retention, special ed, CTE, college readiness. All of these things are available for everyone to see about public schools, and it has really proliferated probably in the past 5 to 10 years. What we know about private schools, though, is relatively thin. There is a little bit that the state collects on things like enrollment, religious denomination, some basic course availability, and teacher characteristics. But it's not a whole lot of information. And so this report really aimed to provide policymakers and the public and taxpayers with just more detailed information about private schools in Michigan. And I think this is particularly important for a variety of reasons, some of which include allowing parents to really make more informed decisions, which I think is particularly poignant in Michigan's robust school choice environment. But it also provides policymakers and parents and taxpayers with just a more complete understanding of the entire education sector in the state of Michigan. And I do want to note that any of the findings that we have here today are not attempting to ascertain really any indicators of private school academic performance or quality. We're simply aiming to provide Michiganders with a better understanding of private education. So where did the data come from for this report? We drew upon two different data sources that I just mentioned. One is the state data. So on the My School Data website that CEPI runs, there is some limited non-public school data. But then we utilized data from the survey that was conducted by the Mackinac Center and MANS. And they distributed emails to 659 private school administrators in March and April of this year. Our response rate was about 50%, which is actually really good in terms of research for a response rate. Typically, if you can get 30 to 40% at that rate, then that's pretty good. So the 50% was a great response. And it was representative of the larger private school population from the data that we have available on private schools. So at the state level, we don't have data on private school population in terms of free and reduced price lunch or race and ethnicity, and so I couldn't really compare to see if those populations were similar, but on things like how many students were served at each grade, I did have that data, and it was representative of the larger population. And then I'm not going to go into too much details about the data or the methods, but if you have additional questions about that, there's some in the report, or I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have at the end of the talk today. So we divided the results into sort of four big buckets: characteristics of private schools, finances, enrollment and capacity, and then offerings and accreditation. And so that's sort of how I'm going to run through them today, and I'm going to start out here with private school characteristics. Whoops, wrong way. So affiliations. We saw a wide variety of religious affiliations, but we did see that over 1/3 of Michigan's private schools are Roman Catholic. But there's many other denominations represented, as you can see in this graph here. And I think a particular note is that about 1/4 of Michigan's private schools have either no specific religious affiliation or are non-religious. When diving a little bit deeper into the unaffiliated secular schools, a lot of those are like Montessori schools that are in this category. Probably to not anyone's huge surprise, just as with public schools in Michigan, private school enrollment has been on the decline for the past 5 years. So national trends, if you look at those, indicate that Catholic schools and non-religious private schools are experiencing the greatest declines. However, this is not really the case in Michigan. Although Catholic school enrollment has declined, it's not really to the extent of some of the other private schools. And then there's actually some types of private schools in Michigan that have seen enrollment growth over the last 5 years, including the unaffiliated schools as well as the Jewish schools. It should be noted here, though, I do want to say that the school, like the Jewish schools, the Christian Scientist schools, those have initially there's a very small number enrolled in these schools, so any changes in those, although it's a large percent, maybe not be a large number of students. So again, probably not all that surprising given that we have declining enrollment. We also have a declining just number of private schools in Michigan. And we also have a declining number of traditional public schools in Michigan. So between 2010 and 15, the number of private schools declined by about 13%. Traditional public schools declined by about 8%. So despite these overall enrollment declines that I just showed you here, even in the public schools, we do see a huge increase in the number of physical public school academies that are popping up in Michigan. So moving on then to geographic location, where are these private schools located? As I mentioned in the introduction, private schools are in 70 of Michigan's 84 counties. And actually over 1/4 of all private schools are located in Oakland and Wayne counties. And although these counties have a large number of private schools, other counties have a higher availability of private schools. And so what this graph shows, the bar shows the number of private schools in that county, but the orange dot that has a percentage above that, that shows sort of the concentration of private schools. So that's the number of private schools per 1,000 school-age children in that county. So as you can see here, Grand Traverse and Bay County, they have a relatively small number of private schools, but per 1,000 school-age children in the state, they have the most, where Genesee County has some of the fewest private schools per 1,000 children. And these figures that I'm talking about here don't include the 14 counties that don't have any private schools in them. So, probably, again, not all that surprising, but there's raw data here to show Michigan's private schools have considerably less socioeconomic diversity than our public schools. So more than 3/4 of both private elementary, middle, and high schools have fewer than 25% free and reduced price eligible students. The average private school serves a student body that's comprised of around 10 to 15% free and reduced price lunch. But it should be noted that there is wide variation in private schools on this account. So some schools serve student bodies that are more than 75% free and reduced price lunch, and others serve little to no free and reduced price lunch students. But as I mentioned, probably this relatively low level of socioeconomic diversity should not be all that surprising to us, particularly because private schools need to charge tuition in order to sort of fund their operations. And so with no public funds to support low-income families, it becomes very difficult for them to afford tuition payments, other than if you can receive some sort of scholarship. The other characteristic that we looked at was teacher qualifications, and so the state data provides a little bit of insight into teachers in private schools. And so relatively quite a few teachers have a Michigan teaching certificate or permit. So 82% have a teaching certificate or permit. 2% actually have a permit or a certificate from another state. And then 14% have a bachelor's degree, but don't hold a Michigan teaching certificate. But all in all, 98% of private school teachers hold at least a bachelor's degree. And then we actually found that 40% of private schools in the state have 100% of their teachers holding a Michigan teaching certificate. So now I'm going to move on to our second bin here, the enrollment and capacity bin. And I think this is particularly important. A lot of times we focus so much on enrollment, but we don't know about schools' capacity. And so this survey actually looked into the capacity of private schools. How many more students could they serve? So first, as previously mentioned, private school enrollment in Michigan has experienced a consistent decline in recent years. And this provides a little bit more insight into the level of decline. And so you can see the K through 8 enrollment has declined the most over the past 8 years. And actually, if you do the past 5 years, high school enrollment has actually increased just slightly. And then this graph here kind of compares it to public schools. And so when you compare private and public school enrollment, K-8 enrollment has declined at a faster rate than that of public schools over the past 5 years. But the opposite is actually true at the high school, which I just mentioned. So actually high school enrollment in private schools over the past 5 years has increased very, very slightly, where public school, high school enrollment has declined by about 9%. And then finally, the glaring bar here is the public school preschool enrollment, which has increased tremendously, likely due to sort of the large influx of state aid for early childhood education under Governor Snyder's administration. So private preschool enrollment has declined over the past 5 years. And so we did a little bit of number crunching, and this is I will caveat this by saying this is a very rudimentary way of looking at this. But despite enrollment declines, private schools are still enrolling a significant number of students, so we looked at sort of what would be the average state per pupil allowance savings. And we found that if you use the per pupil foundation allowance for 2014-15, which is about $7,400 a student on average, and you multiply that by the private school student enrollment, Michigan's annual per pupil foundation allowance appropriation is about $750 million less than it would have to be if all of those students were actually in public schools. And then we did find our survey data suggested that private schools are not filled to capacity. There was many private schools that had additional seats available in their buildings. And so we extrapolated that survey capacity data and found that private schools across the entire state have capacity for about 21,000 or more students. And so again, if we extrapolate that out, if Michigan's private schools were filled to capacity, the annual per pupil foundation appropriation could be approximately $900 million less than if all of those students were in public schools. All right. So speaking on the topic of money, we'll move on to what we learned about private school finances. So non-public school survey responses provided insight into the cost to educate one student for 1 year in their schools. And the majority of schools indicated that it costs somewhere between the $2,500 to $7,500 to educate a primary school student. The average cost was $5,800. High school students, not surprisingly, they're the orange bar. They cost a little bit more to educate, and the majority of schools indicated it was somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to educate a high school student. The average cost there was $9,200. However, the cost to educate a private student varied widely, as you can see by this graph, with some schools indicating that it costs more than $20,000 to educate students, others saying it costs less than $2,500 to educate students. So wide variation. What you will see is quite a theme when it comes to finances. We also asked them how much tuition they charge for one student for 1 year. Again, we see a lot of variation, but the majority of elementary and middle schools charged between $2,500 and $5,000 a student. The average there was $4,700. At the high school level, tuition really varied a lot. There wasn't sort of a bin that the majority of high schools were charging, but the average tuition rate was $7,800 for a high school tuition rate. In addition to these tuition numbers, we also asked about additional fees that they charged. And numerous schools indicated that they had sort of non-tuition charges and fees for things like technology, transportation, sports, student resources, and the average additional fee was around $250 per student. But in some cases, that was a one-time fee, so they just had to pay the first time they entered into the school, and it wasn't an annual fee. And other times, they actually would put that as sort of like a down payment and it would count towards their tuition. So there was a lot of variance in terms of what these additional fees were and how they were incorporated into sort of the tuition. And we asked for additional comments about the tuition, and we found some really interesting and I think relatively novel approaches to tuition by private schools. And so in some cases, schools were using a sliding scale based on income. So as a couple of these talk about, it varies by family. We use facts to assist based on income and expenses. You see in this one here that they had a set tuition rate. However, the parents paid a % of their adjusted gross income if they couldn't afford the $5,000 tuition. We had some that didn't even have a tuition rate. It was just a % of the family income. And then we had some that had discounts for each additional child that they had enrolled in the school. And then many of them had different costs if you were a parishioner in that school or if you were just a community member. So as these sort of show, private schools are not sort of taking a one-size-fits-all approach to tuition. We also saw a lot of variation in tuition assistance for students. And so 1 in 3 private schools does provide financial assistance to families. 34% of elementary and middle school students receive financial assistance, and 40% of high school students receive financial assistance. And the average for an elementary kid is $1,400 or $1,600, and the average for a high school kid is around $2,000. And so that sort of matches with sort of the tuition rates as well. The high school tuition rates are relatively higher, so you see higher financial assistance. And then as with tuition rates, many schools indicated that tuition assistance was highly dependent on individual contexts and family needs. So one question we asked the school administrators was whether or not they were willing to participate in a voucher-like system that many states have in place. And a little less than 3/4 said that they were likely or very likely to participate in such a program. And then we had 13% that said they were very unlikely or unlikely to participate, and 16% weren't sure. So we dug a little bit deeper into sort of some of the comments that they provided after answering this question. And many, even those who said that they were likely or very likely to participate, did indicate that there was a concern about the sort of strings attached to these voucher-like systems. And so some said things like, this would depend on what strings are attached and what paperwork would need to be completed. They said, you know, if reports were required, we would still be very likely. But if the state would want control over our policies of any kind, we would be much more hesitant to participate. And one said, at what cost? Paying twice for education is unfair, talking about the parents that are paying their taxes and sending their child to the private school. But it is more valuable to us than allowing bureaucrats to dictate how and what we must teach our children. So there was a pointed concern at what is attached to these voucher-like systems. So building sort of on this discussion of public monies in the form of vouchers for students who attend private schools, I want to sort of shift the final focus to the area of offerings and accreditation. And so one service that private students have available to them is share time. So for those of you who may not be aware, share time is an agreement between a private school and a public school district that allows a private school student to take non-core classes, so things like foreign language, fine arts, physical education, those sorts of classes taught by teachers employed by the public school district. And then school districts, the public school districts, are able to count these part-time private school students towards their total enrollment for the purposes of collecting state aid for the services they give to that student. And so our survey data indicated that 70% of private schools have at least some students enrolled in a shared time program. And of those private schools whose students are enrolled, 80% actually enrolled at least 71% or more of their students. So if you break this down also at the school level, the average participation rate was 60% for private elementary and middle school students, and 36% for high school students. We also had data on the private school students' dual enrollment levels. So to me, I feel like dual enrollment levels are still relatively low for what it could be, but it is around the state average. I did look, and the state average is around 8%, and private schools enroll about 10% of students. So since 2012, private school students have been afforded the opportunity to dual enroll in a state-funded college-level course without having to first enroll as a part-time public school student. Prior to 2012, they had to enroll as a part-time public school student before they got that offering. But since 2012, that's changed. And so survey data shows that approximately 70% of private schools have at least one student who is dual enrolled. And of those schools that do dual enroll students, as I mentioned, the average percent is around 10%. 89% of those schools enrolled 20% or fewer of their students, though. So another offering that we examined was sort of the offering of annual assessments. I don't know if you want to call that an offering. I don't think kids would call that an offering. But some people might. So private school administrators were asked in which grades they administered an annual norm referenced assessment. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the term, norm reference assessments compare a student's performance to others within their peer group. So a third grade student's norm reference test scores show how the third grader is performing relative to how other third graders perform. So as you can see here, a large majority of private schools are administering norm reference assessments really to 1st through 11th graders. And in addition, or in lieu of these norm reference assessments, we did ask if the private schools administered non-norm reference assessments. So a non-norm reference assessment could show how a third grader achieved specific skills or concepts. And some of the commonly administered ones are things like DIBELS, which show you sort of how far along you are in your reading skills and concepts. And at the elementary and middle school levels, about one out of every 3 private schools administered a non-norm reference assessment. And at the high school level, it was less than 1 out of every 4. So fewer are doing non-norm reference assessments, and quite a few are doing these norm reference assessments. What's interesting, though, is that very few of them are using the state assessment as their norm reference assessment. So now we're on the MSTEP, and so we asked them, do your students take the MSTEP? And just over 3/4 of them indicated that their students do not take the MSTEP. 7% said yes, our students do take it, and then 3% said just they utilize it in some grades. A lot of times it was in 11th grade that they utilized the MSTEP, and we had no response from about 15%. And the private school administrators did provide some insights into the assessments they were using then. And so some of the common ones that they were using was the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which is a widely known assessment, as well as the NWEA assessment. At the middle and high school levels, they also utilized the ACT or the SAT suite of tests, like the ACT Plan, Explore, the PSAT, SAT, things like that. And then finally, in terms of accreditation, we found that most of Michigan's private schools are accredited. 81% are accredited. 19% were not accredited. And then in terms of who they were accredited by, for the most part, they were 53% were accredited by the Michigan Association of Nonpublic Schools, Nonpublic School Accreditation Association. And then there was a couple other big players, the NLSA, the National Lutheran School Association, and Advanced Ed, which is one of the commonly used accreditation agencies by public schools as well, came up on some of those lists. So that is all I have in terms of the data. But just to conclude, I want to say a lot of the focus on improving education has really centered on the public school system, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? We have 93% of our students in those systems, but the 113,000 students in private schools is not an insignificant number, and they shouldn't be left out of these conversations, and policymakers and practitioners should really consider the role that private schools may have in sort of helping to improve educational opportunities for Michigan residents. And so I really think this data provides a unique look and valuable information for anyone learning more about the makeup and characteristics of Michigan's private schools. And so although enrollment has been on the decline in these schools, they still serve a meaningful number of students. And I think this sort of gives us at least a first glance at what these students are experiencing in these schools.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. Anybody have a Q&A card filled out? Please hold those up, and we'll collect those. In the meantime, I have a couple questions to start Rachel off with. First, I'd like to talk about the sample of schools that responded to our survey. So we had slightly more than half of the 600. Mm-hmm. How would you characterize the sample? I mean, it's a good representation. Mm-hmm. Do we see certain kinds of schools more or less represented in that sample, or how would you point to, what would you point to in the sample and say this is a good representative sample? Yeah,
that part was really, really tough for me, especially as a researcher, as you're always trying to ensure that the sample you have matches the entire population. And because the state doesn't have a lot of data on the entire population, it was really, really difficult for me to be able to say our sample represents the entire population. I do have a slide here that shows the grade distribution, and that honestly is the only way that I'm able to look at whether our sample population matched that of the entire state population. You can see here that it's just kind of looks like a rainbow probably from where you're sitting, but it does match relatively well. Our survey data, I would say if any grade was overrepresented, it was pre-K. But for the most part, almost every grade was representative of the entire state when we look at the state data. Unfortunately, I'm not able to say a whole lot about whether or not inner city versus rural versus suburban was represented more. I'm not able to say anything about the percent free and reduced price lunch or about race and ethnicity, which are really important indicators. And I think that's something that further research should definitely look into.
Another question I have for you, maybe just a high-level question. There's, maybe out there some popular misconceptions or mythologies about what private education looks like. As the one who did kind of the ground-level survey work, were there one or two particular findings that you came across in the survey that maybe were the most surprising or maybe the most myth-busting, if you want to put it that way, about what private schools are like in Michigan?
Yeah. I would say there was two, and this is obviously just maybe my personal opinion. One was the teacher qualifications. I think so many times we hear, well, teachers in private schools aren't certified, or they don't even have a high school degree, or different things like that, right? But our data showed that the majority of these teachers are certified and they have a bachelor's degree. So they, although I'm sure in other characteristics or personal characteristics may be or look different than our public school teachers in terms of education level, they're relatively similar. The other thing that I think I found relatively interesting was the assessment. Another sort of myth that we commonly hear is that, well, we don't know how private school kids are performing because they don't assess their kids, and it was very clear in the data that these kids are being assessed, and they're not only just being assessed once. There was many indications that there is a lot of informal assessment going on within these schools to really ensure that these students are making academic progress. And I guess it wasn't all that surprising to me, given sort of the outcome data that we know about private schools, that a lot of students from private schools are succeeding academically after high school, going to college, getting good jobs, and being economically sufficient. But I thought it was very glaring and very important to see that in most cases 70 to 80% of these private schools are assessing their students nearly every year.
So we've got a good batch of questions, and if you more pop into your mind as we go through this process, please write them down, and one of our assistants will track you. Since we're talking about assessments, we have a question here about the MSTEP. I'm not sure if you're able to answer this directly from the survey data, but maybe you can theorize or speak to it a little bit.
Okay.
Regarding the MSTEP, why do so few private schools use the MSTEP assessment? I believe that we were looking at about 10%? Yeah. Very, very few schools did. I think one thing to keep in mind is that the MSTEP was brand new this year. And so had we done this survey a year ago and asked them how many of them were administering the MEP, perhaps that number would have looked different. And that may have been a question that maybe we should have asked, right? But I think partly there's a lot of politics behind sort of this shift to MSTEP. And a lot, even in public schools, a lot of sort of unsureness, if that's a word, around that shift to the MSTEP. And so I would think that may play some role in perhaps over time. Well, I don't know if we're going to still have the MSTEP in a couple of years or not, or maybe we may not even have it next year. So perhaps over time, as these state assessments maybe become more stable, or we are able to sort of buy into them and say that this is a good assessment of students' academic progress, and maybe more private schools buy in. But we didn't ask them if they indicated no. We didn't ask them why did you say no. So it's difficult to say whether or not. Here's a question about some of the characterization of the schools. Please provide some information regarding examples of unaffiliated religious, the unaffiliated religious private schools from the chart. Do we have any examples that would kind of highlight what that group of schools look like?
Yeah, I don't have any slide or anything on that. But in looking through the data, the unaffiliated religious, so these categories are categories that the schools get to check off themselves. It's not like somebody goes in and says like, this is what you are, right? And so even in the unaffiliated religious and unaffiliated, even in unaffiliated secular, they're, to me, looked like schools that would have been religious. Like I was looking through the unaffiliated secular, and in the name of the school it said that, a Baptist school, but they identify as an unaffiliated secular. And so when it comes to the unaffiliated religious, you might see some schools that maybe are supported through a specific religion, but perhaps they identify as unaffiliated because they believe perhaps their curriculum is not focused on one particular religion. And so I would think that that's what some of these schools look like, is that they it has more to do perhaps with their curriculum, not being affiliated with a specific religion.
So we have a couple of questions that came in about the larger enrollment trends, and the first one I want to kind of add on to.
Sure.
Did respondents suggest reasons why private school enrollment is down? And I would say more specifically, I think interesting that particularly the K-8, the elementary and middle school, particularly private school enrollment is down. Any sort of indication from respondents or any thoughts of your own about why that trend line is down?
No indication from respondents, but just from the other research that I do on education finance, I was not at all surprised that high school enrollment wasn't down, but K-8 was down, mainly because of sort of the graying of the population in Michigan. And so over the past 10 years, Michigan has become much older, and very few young residents have been moving to the state. It's getting better. But we were seeing a huge exodus of young families out of the state of Michigan, and also we're just seeing families having fewer children, and so I think it's just a trend in the general population. I don't think by any means it's a trend particular to private or public schools, honestly.
This one may be difficult to answer, but it opens up another topic of conversation. I think that's on several people's minds, and is about the overall enrollment. How does Michigan's 113,000 private school enrollment compare to other states in the Great Lakes region? And how does Michigan's enrollment compare to states with a voucher or tuition tax credit? And I would say both, since pretty much all the other states in the Great Lakes region are states with vouchers or tuition tax credits, that's pretty much the same question, but
yeah.
And do we have any insight into that?
You know what, we don't. I think those are great questions, though, to kind of be able to compare, especially to be able to compare to other states that have voucher-like programs. Immediate, reaction would be yes, they would have higher private school enrollment rates. Particularly, I know Indiana has a very robust statewide voucher system. And so I would think that they have higher enrollment. I think one thing to keep in mind in terms of enrollment is a lot of times the vouchers are specific to low-income families. And so you may, in other states that have the voucher-like programs, maybe your enrollment's higher or lower, but I would think that your enrollment of free and reduced price lunch students would be higher with voucher-like systems.
And the one example that comes to mind, that I'm aware of, probably the biggest, most robust choice program would be the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program, which is completely targeted to free and reduced lunch families. And I believe this year is serving about 80,000 students in Florida, and it's a larger population state, but it does kind of show how that would change the overall enrollment and the demographics of private schools. The very insightful question here, shifting gears a little bit, but but from enrollment to potential enrollment, and that's capacity. In the survey, does the term capacity mean building and physical capacity, or is capacity impacted by the number of teachers or hours available?
So the way that we define capacity was more about physical capacity. It was how many seats do you have in your building, how many classrooms do you have in your building currently. So we did not ask. We do have information about how many teachers they have, but we didn't go with that route of capacity because as more students are enrolling, you have the financial capacity, right, to hire more teachers. So we just went with the capacity that they had in physical space.
All right. So we got a couple of questions here about the offerings section of the survey. And the first one, if a private school is saying it's doing online courses, does it have to do only the online courses, or can it do a lot of other types of teaching and experience? Insights into that?
Let's see. I know the Michigan online school statute is relatively broad, and so you can, the way that they define a cyber school is that you actually can have a brick and mortar building and be an online school. And so I think that might play into a little bit of that question, in that you would be able to be a cyber school and have a brick and mortar building as a private school. But we didn't ask about virtual enrollment,
Right.
And so that's kind of hard to say in terms of this here, how many are enrolled in online courses.
Maybe at this point we could to elaborate a little bit about the dual enrollment, talk a little bit more about what dual enrollment might look like in the private education sector, so people get a sense of the significance of that opportunity and how that's kind of how that's growing. You alluded to.
Yeah. Dual enrollment has really proliferated in both public and private schools over the past 5 to 10 years. I know even when I was in high school, it was not talked about very frequently. So since 2012, prior to 2012, as I mentioned, private school students would have to enroll as a part-time student in a public school in order to have access to dual enrollment. However, under Governor Snyder, in 2012, they enacted a law that let private school students directly enroll in dual enrollment. And so there's a variety of ways that dual enrollment sort of plays out. One is that the student is physically transported to the college and takes college classes at the university. Another is that they take them online through the university. And then a third way is the school can bring a university professor to the private school campus to offer a course there. And so many other states have this same sort of structure when it comes to dual enrollment, and there's benefits and drawbacks to all three of those options. But it is clear that, you know, if you look at the trends over the past 5 to 10 years, more students are taking advantage of the dual enrollment option. And it's a great option for them because essentially you can have an associate's degree, or in some cases be pretty close to having a bachelor's degree by the end of high school. And even some schools now are allowing students to stay on essentially in a 5th year of high school, where then they can graduate from high school with an associate's degree and move on and get their bachelor's in 2 years.
Yeah, you see examples of that. And there was one story recently in the Midland paper about a student at a charter school who completed her bachelor's degree at the same time she completed her high school diploma from Saginaw Valley State. So,
and it's free to the student. It's no cost to the student to get that degree, which is pretty amazing.
Parents who are thinking about college tuition want to look into that one. We have one more question on the offerings category regarding shared time. Why do you think there are fewer high schoolers in the shared time compared to elementary and middle school students?
That's a good question. Obviously, this isn't something that we ask them about. In many cases, well, one, the high schools do have the dual enrollment option, right? And so they can directly dually enroll now instead of enrolling through a public school. So that could be, they may take advantage of that rather than just going to another high school to take advantage of some sort of fine arts class. They can take a fine arts class at Lansing Community College. So that may be part of it. I don't know if I'm going to theorize about any other reasons why that would be the case.
There may be another topic for another time. Some of our private school experts here might have some insights into that too. This is another question that either of us could address, I suppose. Were homeschoolers considered? Are there any data on homeschoolers? Do you have anything? And I might add something.
Yeah, no, homeschoolers were not considered in this data. This went directly to private school administrators, and so homeschoolers weren't in this. reporting requirements for homeschoolers are even smaller than that little requirement that I had there for private schools. We know very, very little about homeschoolers. You know, and a parent can declare their child a homeschool parent at any point in time. They can pull them out, and I think it's something that the state actually has begun to look at a little bit, because when you're looking at students, right, that get say expelled or suspended, and all of a sudden they're a homeschool student, right? I think that has been something that the state has started to look at a little bit, and so this doesn't include homeschool students, and that's something that data is really, really difficult to get on homeschools.
Yeah, Michigan is one of the more lenient homeschool laws, and some homeschoolers are famously unwilling to cooperate with anything that looks like
Yeah, the only requirement I
inspection.
believe in Michigan for a homeschool is that if someone came to your door essentially and said, show me the curriculum, you have to be able to show a curriculum. But you could also just Google homeschool curriculum potentially, and there you have it. So I think it's a pretty lenient state, as you mentioned.
And I think somebody's asked me the question, how many homeschoolers are there in Michigan? And it's a subtraction guessing game at the best from various sources of data. This question, I really like this question. Some may say it's a leading question, but I think it's a good kind of leading question. So it says, could Oakland and Wayne County's ratio of private schools per 1,000 students, going back to that one graph, could that ratio show a failure to meet the demand for education despite the number of private schools in those counties? Maybe it is a leading question.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it could. It could, yeah. It's difficult because of the nature of Oakland and Wayne counties, right? You have Detroit, and then you have a lot of really affluent suburbs in those counties. And so I think a deeper look into the data to see where within these counties these private schools are located could provide a little bit more insight on sort of the availability of these schools to different groups of individuals, be it, you know, in Oakland and Wayne counties have anywhere from very inner city to suburban to rural areas. And so I think diving a little bit deeper into the data to be able to locate where these schools are is important.
All right, any more questions out there? Feel free to turn them in. One area I think that's particularly intriguing, and goes back to our conversation a little bit about how Michigan compares to states with school choice programs, the demographics. These schools in particular in our sample that we looked at, that are the small, less than 10% of the schools that are serving high free and reduced lunch populations. I kind of want to know more about those schools in particular. Are there any correlations or connections between the schools serving high poverty student populations and tuition rates or willingness to participate in the voucher program, or any of the other kind of leading questions in our survey?
Sure, yeah. There was actually, I did a little bit of statistical data analysis to kind of understand this better. I have a couple slides here, and I think it was really interesting to me, so I think maybe the next slide. Yeah, so this just looks like a bunch of numbers, but I'll try to explain. So, and this is really rudimentary, obviously. Although this, you know, we had quite a few responses, still the number of responses makes it difficult to really have very robust statistical significance. But if we look here, if we look at the elementary and middle school percent free and reduced price lunch, there is a positive correlation between free and reduced price lunch rates and the percent of assistance that, or the percent of students that receive financial assistance in the elementary or middle school, as well as the amount of assistance that they receive. What's interesting is that there really was that also correlates at the high school level as well. What's interesting is there's not a correlation between the cost to educate a student in those schools and the tuition that they're charging at either the elementary or the high school level. But when it comes to the free and reduced price lunch status, the schools that are serving greater numbers of free and reduced price lunch kids are providing more assistance to more students. Another little graph that I was putting together compares sort of these financial indicators by free and reduced price lunch, and I just did a straight cut point at 50%. You could do this at other cut points, and I'm sure find really interesting data. But if you look here, for the schools that have 50% or more free and reduced price lunch students, indicating higher needs students, they are showing that their cost to educate these students is much higher. Probably not all that surprising. We know that from research. We know that students that are higher poverty are more costly to educate because they may not have the supports at home to provide those. So also the higher poverty private schools, interestingly, even though it costs them more to educate a student, their tuition is less than those schools that are serving fewer free and reduced price lunch students. And then, as I just mentioned, the percent of students receiving assistance and the amount of assistance that they're receiving is higher in both cases in schools that have that serve a greater student population that's free and reduced price lunch. So I just thought that this was an interesting comparison to show that, especially the top 4 rows there, that the cost to educate a student that is free and reduced price lunch is much higher, but our tuition rates in these schools are lower. But again, I do want to caution the number of schools that are included in here is relatively small, so these are simple correlations, and I don't want to imply any sort of causation around these numbers.
Related, and I don't know to what extent you can chime in on the current events of the day, but if not, I will as well. Any thoughts about the current debate about Detroit Public Schools and what role private schools could play in urban areas? Many of these same sort of subset of schools that we're looking at. Any insights on their capacity and ability to serve more students or other things you may have noticed?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of the conversation right now. I think there have been a couple different examples that it sounds like people have looked into, things like portfolio school districts. And so in places like Philadelphia, they have a portfolio school district, and they essentially have sort of a manager over all of the schools in Philadelphia, and that includes private schools, charter schools, public schools. And so in that instance, they're able to sort of open and close these schools as necessary for the student population that they're serving. And so I think, I would say it was more conversation around the portfolio district in previous legislative years. This year seems to be sort of moving away from that. But I think obviously the private schools have additional capacity. I think, again, being able to dig a little bit deeper to see where these private schools in Oakland and Wayne counties are located is critical to understanding how much capacity they have to serve and assist these students in Detroit Public Schools. But again, even just looking at this data here too, we know that those students are more costly to educate, and although the tuition is lower, it's still tuition, right? And so it's probably for many students in that area difficult for them to be able to take advantage of the private schools without a scholarship. There are a lot of scholarship programs though out there that could contribute. So,
any more questions? I have a couple more questions myself that we can use to wrap up. But if last call for questions, feel free to bring them in. I want to particularly focus on the question of a potential school choice program, which always seems so far away in Michigan. But the question that you ask to private school administrators regarding their willingness to participate in a potential voucher-like program, if I were a private school administrator, I would be inclined to say that really depends. And if you got a lot of those kind of answers, were you able to, maybe not with any hard numbers, but maybe characterize the willingness of schools to participate in what particular issues or regulations would cause the most concern? Is it the fact that most of us don't have to take the state test and we'd have to do that, or are there other potential regulations? And I ask because we know that in states that have done these kind of programs, the percent of schools that are willing to participate makes a difference toward the health of the program and how much they can help students. So you got to balance those things. But any insights in that area?
Yeah, I would say, well, it's interesting because even some of the schools that said that they were likely or very likely to participate, they also left these similar comments, right? And I would say the comments in general had sort of 3 categories. One was just autonomy in general. They wanted to retain sort of this autonomy. I would say probably the most commonly reported one was around being able to continue to to follow their mission as a school, and they didn't want anyone sort of intervening and saying that you cannot, you in any way won't be able to pursue this mission that you have as a school. And then thirdly, it was about reporting, right, and strings attached, and that's been something actually that this legislative session, many of the policymakers have begun to tackle around public schools, is reducing these, I mean, just hundreds of reporting requirements that these school districts have to comply with. And so I think a lot of the private schools are a little bit reticent to say, we're going to open ourselves up to literally doing 100 reports additional to what we have now.
My last question to kind of wrap up kind of brings back to the theme of why we undertook this project. We did the publication, again, inviting people to take a copy home, this presentation and event. Wanted to kind of generate a more informed and engaged conversation in Michigan broadly among policymakers and thought leaders about the role private education can play. And I think that this survey adds a lot to that. Looking forward, what do you see as some of the next, probably they've already been addressed in some of the questions, what are the next frontiers of research or questions you think are the most helpful, vital for us to try to answer about the current state of private education as we go forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think obviously we're limited by what we know with the data that we have, right? And so I think this data that we had sort of begs a few different questions. One is to be able to break these things down by socioeconomic status of the students and by racial and ethnic categories of the students, and really understand how private schools are serving these students, what's available to these students. And so I think that's something that we can look a little bit further into. And obviously, Detroit is a glaring issue here in the state, right? And so I think being able to understand whether or not there is a role that private schools can play in sort of assisting these students in these areas that unfortunately they've had sort of a rough time, I guess, obtaining a quality educational opportunities. And so I think, as we mentioned a couple different times, just being able to dive into where these private schools are located and the ability of students that are less fortunate to really benefit from these services. And then always, like I mentioned at the very beginning, this research says nothing about the quality of these schools, right? And so, so many times we see in the public school sector, these blue ribbon schools or A+ schools or whatever they are, right? These schools that are serving kids really, really well. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned across sectors here, across the public and private sector. And so being able to sort of look at private schools as well who are serving students really, really well, who have good outcomes, are going to college, are getting good jobs and contributing to society. And so I think being able to kind of do the longitudinal look, right, and say this is what a really good private school does. And in terms of flexibility, public schools and private schools can learn from one another.
All right, any last questions? Thank you very much. Let's give Rachel one more round of applause. As you can see, there are a lot. We just scratched the surface with this survey, but hopefully it provokes some more thoughts and feedback from you as you go forward, so please take a copy of that publication. I did not mention we have other Mackinac Center publications in the back. Feel free to browse through those, and our Vote Spotter app. Best way to keep in touch with your state and local state and national legislators, know what you think about important pieces of legislation. And again, thank you everyone for coming today, and have a good safe trip home.